Some slaps don't echo in sound, they echo in silence. Harrison Ford walked into a ballroom in Geneva with nothing but a quiet intention and an envelope folded in his pocket. He wasn't there for the spotlight. He wasn't there to be seen. Yet in one cruel moment, a diamond-studded hand turned that silence into fire. What followed didn't just shatter reputations, it reminded the world that dignity can roar louder than arrogance. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from tonight, and if this story moves you, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The chandeliers burned like suns above the ballroom, throwing rivers of light across crystal tables and dresses stitched with more diamonds than some countries kept in vaults. Geneva's elite had gathered here, the Harrow International Gala, a place where fortunes whispered behind champagne flutes and reputations were bought with a nod. Every eye glittered with self-importance, every laugh rehearsed. Into that noise and shimmer, a man walked alone, Harrison Ford. No red carpet, no entourage, no fanfare, just a simple black shirt, sleeves pressed but unremarkable, tucked into gray slacks. His silver hair caught the light, but he wore no tie, no jewelry, nothing to announce himself in a room obsessed with announcement. The crowd barely looked up. A woman in pearls smirked and leaned toward her friend. Someone's grandfather lost his way. A man in a tuxedo waved half-jokingly for him to clear empty glasses, mistaking him for a server. Harrison did not respond. He moved quietly toward the back wall, past gilded displays of champagne towers and caviar stations, his steps calm, deliberate, like he had walked through far harsher storms than this one. In his jacket pocket rested a folded envelope, the paper thick, heavy. Inside, a check with his name signed steady across the bottom, $3 million. It was meant to vanish into anonymity, the largest donation of the night, given with no demand for credit. But no one in that glittering crowd could have imagined that the man they mocked held the power to fund their entire evening, and no one cared to notice. Veronica Harrow, the queen of the gala, perched at the center of a circle of admirers. Her laughter rang sharp, her glass raised like a scepter. When her eyes fell upon Harrison by the champagne bar, her face twisted. Who let the help wander into the guest area? Her voice sliced through conversation like broken glass. People turned, phones lifted. A ripple of chuckles spread. Harrison turned slowly, a glass of still water in his hand, his expression steady, unreadable. He did not correct her. He did not explain. He simply stood. Veronica's heels struck marble as she advanced, her orbit of tuxedoed men following like obedient shadows. She seized the glass from his hand, flung the water onto the floor where it splashed against his shoes, then swung her clutch against his chest. Glass shattered on tile, the echo biting through the hall, and then came the slap. Her diamond-studded fingers cracked across his face, leaving a thin red line along his cheek. The room gasped as one. For a moment time seemed to fracture. Harrison's head turned with the impact, but his feet never moved. His hands stayed at his sides, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift a hand in return. He simply endured. A hush rippled out across the ballroom, broken by a snicker, then another, and the cold flash of a camera. Veronica flicked her wrist as if brushing away dust. Escort this man out, and bleach the floor where he stood. Security shifted uneasily, unsure if the order was serious, but no one moved to defend him. No one dared. Harrison dabbed the blood with a linen napkin, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. He breathed once, slow, calm. The chandeliers blazed on. The orchestra played as though nothing had happened, and the world returned to its laughter. But in the shadows, a storm had already begun, because the man humiliated before them was not some forgotten stranger. He was Harrison Ford, and the silence he carried was about to speak louder than every voice in that room. The service hallway behind the ballroom was colder, lit by fluorescent strips that hummed faintly above white walls and steel doors. The noise of the gala faded with every step, replaced by silence so heavy it felt deliberate, as if the world itself wanted to smother what had just happened. Two security guards walked on either side of Harrison Ford, their eyes fixed forward, their hands twitching with unease. They had no idea who he was. Or maybe they did, and were too afraid to say it. Harrison's cheek still bore the thin red line where Veronica's diamond ring had cut skin. He pressed a folded linen napkin against it, not roughly, just enough to stop the blood. Then he slipped it into his pocket like something worth keeping. His face gave nothing away. No anger, no humiliation, only a kind of quiet patience that unsettled the men escorting him. A young waiter carrying trays stacked high with empty glasses came around the corner and froze. His eyes widened, his breath caught. He opened his mouth as though to speak. "That's Harrison Ford." but another waiter grabbed his sleeve and shook his head sharply. The words died in his throat. They both knew better than to interrupt whatever this was. Harrison kept walking. His shoes tapped against the marble, steady, unhurried. The manager of the event rushed down the hallway toward him, wringing his hands, stammering apologies. "Sir, if you could just, follow the exit here, there's a change of clothes waiting if you—" His voice faltered under the weight of Harrison's silence. Harrison stopped. For a moment it looked as though he might finally speak, that he might unleash the fury the crowd had expected but never received. Instead, his eyes softened with something almost weary, and he said only 5 words. "It's fine, I'll walk." Nothing more, no complaint, no explanation, just calm. The manager froze, unable to respond. Harrison stepped past him, shoulders squared, posture unbroken. Behind him, the gala roared on, laughter spilling through closed doors like static. Ahead of him, the corridors stretched into shadow, each fluorescent light flickering as though uncertain whether to shine. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like defeat, the slow retreat of a man driven out. But there was something in the way he moved, something in the weight of his silence that told a different story. This was not surrender, it was restraint. It was the kind of quiet that waits, that watches, that carries storms within it. And in that silence, history had already begun to turn. The security control room smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and dust from too many old wires. Screens lined the wall in a pale blue glow, flickering with feeds from every corner of the gala. Elias sat hunched forward, 21 years old, his uniform jacket too big for his frame, fingers trembling over the keyboard. He had seen it all unfold. The glass, the slap, the silence. The moment the diamond cut Harrison Ford's cheek replayed again and again in his head like a wound that wouldn't close. He leaned closer to the monitor and hit rewind. The glass shattered, the crowd gasped, the slap landed, and the man did not move. Elias swallowed hard. It wasn't weakness. It was something else, something heavier that shook him more than any act of violence could. He pressed record on his own screen capture system, syncing the audio, storing every frame. Official policy said all security feeds were archived, but he knew how quickly those archives could disappear if the wrong person ordered it. He wasn't just recording. He was preserving proof. His mouse hovered over the save icon, then clicked. A file appeared on the desktop, Gala 2147, MP4. His heart pounded so loudly, he thought the cameras above him might hear. He pulled up an email draft, stared at the blank field for a long moment, then typed an address he had memorized weeks ago during late-night internet scrolling, Ford Aviation Foundation. He didn't know if anyone would read it. He only knew the name had always stood for something honest, stories of rescue missions flown in storms, of lives pulled from canyons. Elias attached the file, typed 3 words, "I saw everything," and dragged the mouse to send. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the screen blinked. Every monitor in front of him flickered to black and back again. One camera feed glitched, a red light flashing at the corner as if the system itself had noticed. Elias froze, his breath caught. Did someone see him? Did they already know? He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, ready to rip the power cord out if he had to. 5 seconds later, his inbox pinged. A reply, no signature, no header, no decoration, just one sentence. "Thank you. Stay silent, stay safe." Elias read it twice, 3 times. The words steadied him even as fear crawled down his spine. Somewhere out there, someone had seen, someone who mattered. He leaned back in his chair, chest rising and falling too fast, eyes darting to the ceiling cameras. He was no hero. He was just a kid in a room full of screens. But tonight, he had chosen a side. And though the gala above danced on in ignorance, a storm was already brewing in silence, born from one slap, one recording, and one email that would change everything. Morning light spilled across Zurich like liquid gold, sliding over glass towers and marble balconies. In a penthouse high above the city, Veronica Harrow reclined in a silk robe, an espresso cup poised between 2 manicured fingers. She smiled at her reflection in the glass, satisfied that last night's interruption had been nothing more than a minor embarrassment, soon to be forgotten in the glow of her empire. Then her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, government-coded, clipped. He answered with the sharpness of someone accustomed to authority. The voice on the other end did not tremble. "Ms. Harrow, this is the Swiss Federal Financial Authority. Your accounts have been frozen effective immediately." Silence cracked across her balcony like thunder. She rose, espresso sloshing onto the floor. "That's absurd. Harrow Global Arts is the premier philanthropic institution in Europe." The voice was calm, deliberate. and it is now under investigation for irregularities. The line went dead. Veronica stared at her phone, her pulse racing, her robe sticking to her back. But this was only the first stone in an avalanche. Within minutes, another alert. Transfer request denied. 30 seconds later, another. Transaction blocked. Then another and another. Notifications poured in like machine gun fire. By the time she dropped the phone onto the marble table, 5 banks had locked her assets. She tried to laugh, but the sound died in her throat. Down below, the city was already awake with whispers. The video had surfaced. A shaky clip, grainy but undeniable, time-stamped, uncut. It showed Veronica striking Harrison Ford across the face, his silver hair catching the light, the blood sharp against his cheek. It captured the arrogance in her voice, the cruelty in her dismissal. Within 2 hours, it had surpassed 10 million views. By noon, it was everywhere. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. #slap of disgrace. #justice for Ford. #respect is earned. Reaction videos flooded TikTok. Teenagers gasped. Lawyers dissected body language. Veterans posted comments like, "This is what restraint looks like." Memes twisted her image into caricature, split screens of her slap alongside headlines of collapsed charities. And Harrison was no longer invisible. Reporters dug into archives, resurfacing stories the world had half forgotten. Grainy local news footage of his helicopter lowering into a Wyoming canyon to rescue a hiker near death. Articles about him volunteering during California wildfires, ferrying supplies in his own plane. Photos of him in jeans and boots, standing beside exhausted firefighters, no cameras, no press release. A man who had spent his life in front of Hollywood lights, but who kept his truest acts in the shadows. The contrast was brutal. Veronica with her diamonds and disdain, and Harrison Ford with nothing but quiet deeds that never asked for recognition. Comment sections filled with rage. She slapped a man who saved strangers. She humiliated dignity itself. The wrong person bled. Corporate sponsors noticed. By mid-afternoon, 3 luxury brands released statements cutting ties with the Harrow Foundation. One tweeted, "We stand with those who show true integrity. Effective immediately, we will no longer partner with Veronica Harrow." Shares of her associated companies dipped, then plunged. By the time evening came, news anchors on every continent were repeating the same phrase. The slap heard around the world. Veronica watched the coverage unfold, each headline another blade. She shouted at her publicist, fired her social media team, demanded statements to repair her image. But no statement could erase the image burned into millions of screens. Harrison Ford standing still, blood on his cheek, silent in the face of cruelty. Across the ocean, journalists crowded outside the Ford Aviation Foundation in Los Angeles. They wanted a statement, but there was none. The building remained shuttered, blinds drawn. When a reporter finally caught sight of Harrison himself, walking across the lot in his same black shirt, he raised a hand, not in anger, not in triumph, just in quiet refusal to speak. And that silence was louder than any press conference. The storm was no longer about one woman's arrogance. It was about the contrast between noise and truth, between spectacle and substance. Veronica had meant to humiliate a man she thought beneath her. Instead, she had ignited the memory of who he truly was, not a relic of cinema, not an old man lost at a gala, but a man who had flown through storms to pull strangers from death, a man who had faced down fire not with speeches, but with action. And now, because of her slap, the world was remembering. By nightfall, Veronica's face filled every screen, but not with reverence. With scorn, her empire trembled, her legacy cracked. And Harrison Ford, who had asked for nothing, who had entered the ballroom only to give, was suddenly at the center of a reckoning. He had not lifted a hand, had not raised his voice, but the truth had been given a microphone, and the world was finally listening. By the second morning, the storm was no longer digital gossip. It was a tidal wave crashing across borders, ripping through financial centers and newsrooms with the same relentless rhythm as breaking glass. International media led with one name, Veronica Harrow. Underneath it, 2 words burned in bold across magazine covers and front pages: fraud, fall. The gala that was supposed to crown her as Europe's queen of philanthropy had become her public execution. Emails surfaced first. A former accountant, dismissed 3 years earlier, released a PDF containing spreadsheets, wire transfers, and disguised bribes. Line after line showed donations rerouted into offshore accounts, charitable funds disguised as consulting fees, millions diverted through shell companies in Malta and the Cayman Islands. The documents spread faster than the video itself. Financial journalists pounced. Auditors gave quotes to cameras. Lawyers dissected every figure. Within hours, the Swiss authorities were joined by investigators from London, Washington, and Brussels. Every file folder stamped Harrow Foundation was suddenly reopened. Every bank that had once courted her name now scrambled to freeze it. In offices thick with cigarette smoke and legal jargon, prosecutors drafted subpoenas with the efficiency of surgeons. Every cut went deeper. Employees who had once whispered about her arrogance now spoke on record. A dismissed project manager recalled being ordered to falsify grant reports. A junior assistant admitted she had been paid to shred receipts. Even her personal chauffeur described monthly envelopes of cash delivered to politicians in exchange for tax exemptions. The image of Veronica Harrow, once framed in pearls and champagne, now lay buried under headlines calling her Europe's grand illusion. Sponsors fled. Luxury brands that had paid her to stand in their ads deleted every trace of her face from their archives. The opera house she had funded removed her nameplate with a hammer and chisel, live-streamed by gleeful journalists. One post went viral, a short clip of the marble dust falling from the wall, captioned "Empires Turn to Dust." Yet through the avalanche, one figure remained still: Harrison Ford. He gave no interviews. He issued no statements. The world searched for his response, but found nothing, until a single photograph emerged. Snapped by a freelance reporter outside a Los Angeles office, it showed Harrison leaning against his truck in the parking lot, head slightly bowed, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans. The scar on his cheek still faint, his eyes cast downward, not in shame, not in triumph, but in the kind of silence that carried more weight than thunder. Someone posted it with a caption, "The man who didn't have to fight back." Within hours, the image was everywhere. Reaction threads filled with reverence. Commenters wrote, "He didn't need to shout, and that's why his voice is louder than all of them." Another post read, "Veronica used noise, Harrison used silence, guess who won?" That picture, unposed and unremarkable to anyone else, became the defining portrait of the scandal. Meanwhile, Veronica unraveled. Her lawyers resigned after she refused to cooperate. A leaked memo revealed she had attempted to move assets into cryptocurrency wallets hours before her accounts froze, an act investigators called financial desperation. Photos of her leaving her penthouse in oversized sunglasses filled tabloids, each accompanied by words like disgraced, cornered, exposed. Court filings revealed staggering figures: 41 million siphoned from charitable donations. The more the numbers grew, the smaller her presence became. Commentators who once praised her glamour now dissected her downfall as if it were inevitable, as if the slap had only torn the curtain hiding what was always there. And through it all, Harrison's silence echoed louder. Television anchors replayed the slap in split screen with the photo of him standing by his truck. The contrast was devastating. Her violence against his restraint, her noise against his quiet. Social feeds buzzed with a new mantra: dignity is louder than power. In Washington, a congressman remarked to reporters, "It's poetic, isn't it? The man she thought was nobody was the one who gave her downfall a face." Investigations widened. In London, the Charity Commission subpoenaed 5 years of Harrow Global Arts filings. In Washington, the IRS reopened dormant cases. In Malta, authorities padlocked the doors of her private gallery and plastered seizure notices across the glass. Televised live to the delight of millions who remembered the slap. Her empire collapsed not with one blow, but with thousands, each headline a hammer strike, each whistleblower another crack. And all of it fueled not by Harrison's revenge, but by his refusal to play her game. Late-night hosts joked about her arrogance, yet their laughter softened when they mentioned him. One monologue ended with a quiet line that went viral on its own: "He didn't fight back, and that's why we all fight for him." By the end of the week, Veronica was no longer a philanthropist, no longer an icon. She was a warning. Her empire had detonated in the eyes of the world. But Harrison Ford, the man she slapped into silence, stood untouched. His greatest act was no act at all. His refusal to strike back had become the strike that ended her, and in that silence, history found its verdict. The courtroom in Zurich was not grand. No marble pillars or dramatic chandeliers, just polished wood, a row of magistrates, and a gallery so packed that reporters stood pressed against the walls. Outside, cameras waited in the cold, starved for even a glimpse of the verdict, but inside the air was heavy with silence. Every eye in the room fixed on the large screen at the front as the lights dimmed and the video began to play. The footage was raw, time-stamped, uncut. The moment Veronica Harrow raised her voice, the glass shattering at Harrison Ford's feet, the slap that split his cheek. The sound of the crowd gasping, the cruel laughter, the word peasant, and finally the image of Harrison standing still, blood sliding down his jaw, refusing to answer violence with violence. The room did not breathe. The magistrates watched, their faces unreadable, as Veronica sat stiff at the defendant's table, her platinum hair dulled, her eyes darting, her lips trembling each time the slap echoed from the speakers. When the video ended, the silence was louder than any verdict. The lead magistrate leaned forward, his voice steady. "This court is not assembled to punish arrogance. We are here for fraud, exploitation, and laundering of charitable funds totaling over $40 million. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Veronica's hands clenched against the table, her knuckles white. The magistrate continued, "Mr. Ford has declined to press personal charges related to the assault, but the truth has not remained silent." At that, the cameras shifted to Harrison. He sat alone, straight-backed, his silver hair catching the dim light, eyes not on the bench, not on Veronica, but on the tall window at the side of the room where daylight streamed in. He looked as though the trial was happening somewhere far away, as though he had already made peace with it. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Mr. Ford, do you wish to make a statement?" All lenses swung to him. The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion, for anger finally released, for the words everyone wanted him to throw like stones. Instead, Harrison turned his head, calm, unshaken, and spoke with the gravel of a man who had lived long enough to know the weight of silence. "I'm not here for revenge, I just don't play their game. Nothing more." The words landed harder than any accusation. The gallery stirred. A low current of awe sweeping through. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the line would echo across headlines before sunset. Veronica shifted in her seat, her face paling, because in those few words he had dismantled the defense she clung to. The magistrate nodded once, almost as if acknowledging that the lesson had already been delivered. Then he dropped a thick file onto the desk with a heavy thud. The ruling, millions in damages, permanent bans, assets seized, restrictions imposed. But no handcuffs, no dramatic drag across the floor. Instead, she was left to sit in the ruins of her own name, destroyed not by shouting, but by truth spoken in a whisper. Harrison Ford did not look at her. He rose when instructed, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and walked toward the exit as calmly as he had walked out of the gala. Behind him, the press erupted into questions, voices tripping over one another, desperate for more. But he gave them nothing, because the lesson was already carved into stone. Sometimes, the loudest thunder comes from a man who refuses to raise his voice. The ballroom did not look the same. A year had passed, but the chandeliers that once glittered like suns now hung heavier, their light softened, their brilliance muted. The laughter that once echoed too loudly in every corner was now quieter, clipped at the edges. This was no longer the Harrow International Gala. The banners read differently now. Voices for the voiceless. No family name, no single benefactor's title carved in steel, just a promise that the night was for those who had none. Guests arrived cautiously, their smiles thinner, their glances sharper. They remembered too well what had happened under these very chandeliers the year before, and at the center of the room stood a glass case on a pedestal, draped under its own spotlight. Inside was a simple black shirt, slightly wrinkled, a stitched tear over the chest, and just below the collar, a faint, almost invisible trace of blood. Etched into the steel plaque beneath it were 7 words. "Respect is not worn. It's earned." The crowd circled it, whispers moving like a current through the air. It was not jewelry or champagne that commanded their attention now, but a relic of humility preserved under glass. For the first time, wealth leaned in not to flaunt, but to remember. When the lights dimmed, a hush fell across the hall. The stage stood empty, waiting. And then, without fanfare, without music, Harrison Ford stepped into the room. He wore no tuxedo, no polished adornments. Just a freshly pressed black shirt, almost identical to the one sealed behind glass, and gray slacks that might have looked out of place anywhere else but here. His silver hair tied back, his walk steady, his face unreadable. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The ripples spread as heads turned, not in mockery this time, not in condescension, but in silence that carried something heavier than awe. Respect. He moved to the podium, the spotlight following. For a moment he said nothing. The room held its breath, the weight of 1,000 stories pressing against the walls. Then he leaned toward the microphone, his voice low, gravelly, steady. "I didn't come here for applause. I came here to see the truth stand. Nothing more, just that, and it was enough." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with recognition, with the unspoken admission that dignity could stand taller than diamonds, that humility could outlive arrogance. Slowly, the applause began. Not the thunderous ovations of people performing for cameras, but a steady, human rhythm that carried through the hall. Veronica's old seat, once draped in pearls and noise, remained empty by design, her name scrubbed from every program, her legacy reduced to dust. Yet her absence was its own presence, a reminder that arrogance burns itself to ash when struck by truth. After the speech, when the lights shifted and conversations resumed, a boy no older than 10 made his way to the stage. His blazer was too big for his frame, his shoes clumsy on the polished floor. He carried a folded piece of paper, trembling slightly in his hand. The crowd watched as he walked up to Harrison and held it out. Harrison bent down, his tall frame folding with surprising gentleness, and accepted it. The paper was a drawing, stick figures under chandeliers, a red line drawn across a man's cheek. And beneath it, the words scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Thank you for not yelling. You made me feel strong." Harrison looked at the drawing for a long moment, then leaned closer to the boy and whispered something only he could hear. The boy nodded, his eyes wide, his shoulders lifting as if he suddenly stood taller. The hall did not hear the words, but they felt the moment. A murmur of emotion moved through the crowd, people lowering their eyes, some wiping at them. Because it was not power they had just witnessed, but strength that required no volume. Later that night, as the gala thinned and the music softened, a photographer captured a final image. Harrison stood alone beside the glass case, his hands folded behind his back, gazing at the shirt. The spotlight cut across his face, leaving one half in shadow, the other in light. It was not staged. It was not posed. Just a man in silence, remembering. That photograph traveled the world. It won awards not because of who he was, but because of who he refused to become. The narrative was no longer about wealth or humiliation or the fall of a socialite. It was about choice. A man humiliated, blood drawn before a laughing crowd, who chose not to strike back, who chose not to play the game of cruelty, and in doing so let the truth speak louder than noise. Outside the ballroom, banners no longer bore names of elites. They bore names of charities, of children, of causes forgotten. The gala had been reborn not in spectacle, but in meaning. And Harrison Ford, the man who had walked into the storm and carried his silence through it, had given it that meaning. As he stepped out into the night, cameras flashed one last time. He did not pause, did not pose, only walked into the darkness beyond the lights. The photo of his profile, half in shadow, half in light, became the symbol of a year when the world remembered that silence is not weakness, restraint is not surrender, and respect is not worn, it is earned. And for those who had watched it unfold, the lesson remained carved deeper than any headline. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that never has to shout. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.